There is a moment that haunts every human being. It arrives without warning, often in the stillness between heartbeats, in the pause between words. You are standing before someone you thought you knew, a lover, a friend, a stranger who has somehow become essential. And suddenly, inexplicably, you see something that makes your blood run cold, not because they have changed, but because you recognize something ancient and familiar staring back at you. Something you have spent your entire life running from, something that wears your face. This is not a ghost story, though it might feel like one. This is not about possession, though you will feel possessed. This is about the most profound and terrifying truth of human connection, that every person you have ever loved, every person you have ever hated, every person who has ever made you feel truly alive or completely destroyed, has been a mirror, and what you saw in them was never them at all. It was always you. Tonight we descend into the shadow, that vast unmapped territory of the psyche that Carl Jung called the thing a person has no wish to be. We venture into the paradox that governs all human relationships, that we do not see people as they are, but as we are, that the stage of human connection is lit not by the light of objective truth, but by the flickering projector of our unconscious mind, casting upon others the film of our own unresolved story. Consider this. You have met the same person 1,000 times. They wear different faces, different names, different bodies, but the pattern is always, unmistakably, the same. The unavailable lover who makes you chase, the friend who betrays you at the crucial moment, the authority figure who never sees your worth, the partner who suffocates you with their need. You tell yourself that the world is simply full of these people, that you are unlucky in love, cursed in friendship, destined to repeat these painful cycles. But what if the truth is far stranger and far more powerful than that? What if you have been hunting yourself through the corridors of human connection? What if every relationship has been an archaeology of your own psyche, each person you encounter serving as a sacred excavation site for the parts of yourself you buried alive? What if you keep meeting yourself because that is the only meeting that was ever truly possible? The ancient Greeks understood something we have forgotten. They knew that the word person comes from persona, the mask worn by actors in their theatrical performances. But they also knew something deeper, that beneath the mask is not a face at all, but another mask, and beneath that mask another, and so on into the infinite regress of identity. We are not single, unified beings having relationships with other single, unified beings. We are multiplicities encountering multiplicities, shadows dancing with shadows, projections falling in love with projections. And in this hall of mirrors, something both beautiful and terrible occurs. We mistake our reflection for reality. We call it love. We call it destiny. We call it chemistry. But what we are really experiencing is the uncanny recognition of ourselves in the other. The fragments we disowned, the qualities we repressed, the potentials we abandoned, suddenly made visible in human form. This is the architecture of projection. This is why your mother appears in your lover. This is why your father's anger erupts from your boss's mouth. This is why the friend you thought you knew transforms overnight into your childhood tormentor. Not because they have changed, but because you have finally seen what was always there, not them, but you, reflected back with perfect, merciless clarity. Tonight's journey will take us deep into this phenomenon. We will trace its origins from the dawn of human consciousness, through the revolutionary discoveries of depth psychology, into the latest revelations of neuroscience and quantum physics. We will explore how the brain constructs reality through prediction and projection, how relationships serve as theaters for the unconscious, how the shadow, that repository of everything we cannot accept about ourselves, becomes the director of our emotional lives. But more than that, we will discover something that changes everything, that this is not a flaw in the human design. This is not a problem to be solved. The shadow in relationships is not an obstacle to authentic connection. It is the path to it. Every projection is a sacred clue, every repetition a doorway, every painful pattern a map leading you home to the parts of yourself you abandoned long ago. You see, the shadow is not your enemy. The shadow is your lost twin, your exiled sovereign, your dismembered God. And relationships, with all their beautiful, agonizing intensity, are the ritual through which you are slowly, painstakingly, becoming whole again. By the time this journey ends, you will understand why you fall in love with the same person over and over again. You will see how your deepest wounds became your unconscious attraction algorithms. You will recognize the invisible puppet strings of projection that have controlled your every relationship. And most importantly, you will learn how to transform these patterns, not by avoiding projection, but by making it conscious, by owning your shadow, by turning the mirror around and finally, meeting yourself face to face. This is the story of how we become strangers to ourselves, and how through the mysterious alchemy of human connection, we might, if we are brave enough, find our way back home. The question is not whether you will meet your shadow in your relationships. You will. You already have. The question is, will you recognize it when you do? Will you have the courage to claim it? Or will you continue to blame others for carrying the parts of yourself you refuse to own? The mirror is waiting. Your reflection has been calling to you your entire life. It is time at last to look. To understand why we keep meeting ourselves in others, we must first understand how we became strangers to ourselves. This is the primordial wound of human consciousness, the moment we fractured into the known and the unknown, the acceptable and the unacceptable, the light and the shadow. Long before Carl Jung mapped the geography of the psyche, long before Freud dared to speak of the unconscious, there was a story. It is the oldest story, told in 1,000 variations across every culture that has ever existed. It is the story of the exile, of paradise lost, of the fall from grace, of the moment humanity became conscious, and in becoming conscious, became divided. In the beginning, say the myths, we were whole. The biblical Adam before the knowledge of good and evil. The Greek Golden Age before Pandora's box. The Taoist state of Wu-Wei before the mind learned to grasp and separate. We existed in a state of undifferentiated unity, not yet fractured by judgment, not yet carved by the knife of language into this and that, good and bad, me and not me. But then came the catastrophe of consciousness, the eating of the fruit, the opening of the forbidden box. The moment the human mind learned to reflect upon itself, to judge itself, to divide the seamless whole of experience into categories of acceptable and unacceptable. And in that moment, the shadow was born. The shadow is not evil, though it contains what we call evil. The shadow is not darkness, though it dwells in darkness. The shadow is simply everything that consciousness cannot include in its story of who I am. It is the remainder, the rejected, the repository of all the qualities, impulses, and potentials that did not fit the image we needed to construct to survive our particular childhood, our particular family, our particular culture. Picture a child. She is born with a vast spectrum of human possibility contained within her small body, the capacity for rage and tenderness, wildness and discipline, selfishness and generosity, cowardice and courage. She is all things, potentially. But then the world begins to teach her what she is allowed to be. "Big girls don't cry," says her father when she falls and skins her knee, and so she takes her sadness, her vulnerability, her need for comfort, and she pushes it down into the darkness. It doesn't disappear. It becomes shadow. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" asks her mother when she dances too loudly, laughs too freely, takes up too much space. And so she takes her vitality, her authenticity, her uninhibited joy, and she buries it alive. It joins the shadow. You're too sensitive, the world tells her when she feels too much. You're too angry when she feels her power. You're too selfish when she asserts her needs. You're too much, again and again, until the message is clear. To be loved, to be accepted, to survive, you must become less than you are. You must amputate the unacceptable parts of yourself, and so the shadow grows. With every judgment, every rejection, every moment we choose belonging over authenticity, we feed the shadow. By the time we reach adulthood, we have become expert curators of our conscious identity, displaying only the sanitized, socially acceptable aspects of ourselves, while hiding the vast museum of our rejected qualities in the basement of the unconscious. But here is what we don't understand. The shadow is not dead. What we bury alive remains alive, and like all living things that are trapped in darkness, it seeks the light. It will find a way to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. If it cannot emerge directly through us, it will emerge as the world around us. It will appear in the form of other people. This is projection, the fundamental mechanism through which the shadow operates in relationships. Jung described it as the unconscious transfer of our own unrecognized qualities onto others. We take the aspects of ourselves we cannot accept, and we externalize them. We see them out there instead of in here. We experience them as properties of other people rather than properties of our own psyche. And once this projection mechanism is activated, something extraordinary happens. The world becomes a living Rorschach test. Every person we meet becomes a screen upon which we project the film of our unconscious. We don't see them as they are, we see them as we are. Or more precisely, we see them as we aren't, as we refuse to be. The mechanism is ancient, far older than humanity itself. It emerges from the basic architecture of perception, the way the brain constructs reality from the fragmentary data of the senses. Neuroscience has revealed that we do not passively receive reality, we actively predict it. The brain is a prediction machine, constantly generating models of what it expects to encounter, based on past experience, and then adjusting those models based on sensory input. But in the realm of human relationship, this prediction machinery becomes something else entirely, a projection machinery. We don't just predict what others will do, we project onto them what we need them to be, what we fear they might be, what we secretly are but cannot admit. We dress them in the costumes of our unconscious drama and cast them in roles they never auditioned for. This is not conscious. We do not wake up and decide to project our shadow onto our romantic partner. It happens automatically, invisibly, with the seamless efficiency of breathing. One moment, you are meeting a new person. The next moment, without any conscious awareness that something has shifted, you are encountering your father's abandonment, your mother's judgment, your siblings' competition, your own repressed rage, hunger, shame, or desire. The ancient alchemists understood this process through the symbol of projectio, the first stage of the great work, where the base matter of the unconscious is thrown outward onto the world. They knew that before we can transform lead into gold, before we can integrate the shadow and become whole, we must first see it. And the only way to see it is for it to appear externally, personified in the people and situations of our lives. Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, both in his patients and in himself. He discovered that projection follows recognizable patterns, what he called complexes, autonomous clusters of thoughts, feelings, and memories organized around a central core of traumatic experience or unmet need. These complexes live in the unconscious like independent personalities, each with its own agenda, its own perspective, its own method of hijacking consciousness. And they have one primary method of manifesting in the world: through our relationships. The mother complex seeks out lovers who will smother or abandon. The father complex attracts authority figures who will approve or condemn. The shadow complex magnetizes people who embody the qualities we most vehemently deny in ourselves. The aggression we've repressed, the sexuality we've shamed, the power we've disowned. This is the origin of what we call chemistry or attraction or fate. We feel drawn to certain people with an intensity that seems to transcend logic or choice. We tell ourselves stories about soulmates and destiny, twin flames and cosmic connection. But the truth is far more psychological and far more personal. We are drawn to people who activate our complexes, who resonate with our wounds, who promise to either heal our childhood pain or reenact it with perfect precision. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate unresolved situations from the past, over and over, with different people in different contexts, but always the same essential dynamic. We are not consciously choosing to repeat our trauma. We are unconsciously seeking to master it, to finally get it right, to resolve what could not be resolved in childhood. But here's the paradox. We cannot resolve it through projection. As long as we are unconsciously casting others in the roles of our past, we cannot truly meet them. And as long as we cannot meet them, we cannot meet ourselves. The relationship becomes a closed loop, a hall of mirrors reflecting only our own unresolved pain back to us infinitely. This is the tragedy of projection, but also, if we can bear to look clearly, its gift. Because every projection is a breadcrumb trail leading back to the shadow. Every person who triggers us is pointing to an unintegrated part of ourselves. Every pattern we repeat is an invitation to become conscious, to reclaim what we've lost, to retrieve the gold we buried in the darkness. The ancient wisdom traditions knew this. The Egyptian mysteries spoke of the Ba and the Ka, the visible and invisible souls, and the journey to reunite them. The Gnostic Gospels describe the divine spark fragmented and scattered through matter, seeking to recognize itself and return to wholeness. The Kabbalists mapped the shattering of the primordial vessels and the sacred work of tikkun, gathering the shattered shards of divine light. These are all metaphors for the same process. The journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from projection to recognition, from the exile of the shadow to the integration of the self. And the primary vehicle for this journey, the sacred crucible where this transformation occurs, is human relationship. Because in relationship, the shadow cannot hide. In relationship, our projections become visible. In relationship, we are confronted again and again with the aspects of ourselves we most need to reclaim. The beloved becomes the mirror. The enemy becomes the teacher. Every person who disturbs our peace is showing us exactly where we are not yet whole. This is why spiritual traditions across the world have emphasized relationship as the royal road to enlightenment, not despite its challenges, but because of them. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of difficult people as our greatest teachers, showing us exactly where we are stuck. The Sufi poets wrote ecstatically of the beloved as the mirror in which God sees God. The Christian mystics understood that we encounter Christ not in isolation, but in the face of the other, especially the suffering other. They all understood what modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover, that we cannot become whole in isolation. We need the mirror of relationship to see ourselves. We need the clash and friction of intimate connection to reveal what is hidden. We need others to carry our shadow so that we can finally, painstakingly, begin to reclaim it. But this reclamation requires something that most humans desperately resist: the willingness to turn the mirror around. To stop asking, what is wrong with them, and start asking, what is this showing me about myself? To cease being the victim of others' flaws and become the archaeologist of our own psyche. This is not blame. This is not saying that you caused someone else's behavior or that abuse is your fault. This is saying something far more subtle and far more powerful, that your response to others, your emotional activation, your patterns of attraction and repulsion, these are yours. They belong to your psyche, and they are trying to tell you something essential about who you are and who you might become. Now we must descend deeper into the specific mechanisms through which the shadow operates in the theater of relationship. Here, in the intimate arena of romantic love, friendship, and family bonds, the unconscious stages its most elaborate productions. Here, the drama of projection reaches its most intense expression. And here, we encounter the central mystery of human connection, why we fall in love with people who wound us in precisely the ways we were wounded before. There is a woman. Let us call her Maya. She is 33 years old, intelligent, accomplished, aware. She has been in therapy. She has read the books. She knows intellectually about attachment patterns and childhood wounds and the repetition compulsion. And yet, for the 5th time in her adult life, she finds herself in love with a man who is emotionally unavailable. This time, she tells herself, it will be different. He is different. More self-aware than the last one, more willing to try, more capable of growth. The warning signs are there from the beginning. The inconsistent communication, the difficulty with intimacy, the way he seems to flee whenever she moves closer, but she doesn't see them. Or rather, she sees them and tells herself a story that transforms them into something else. He's just busy. He's been hurt before. He needs time. If she can just be patient enough, understanding enough, perfect enough, he will finally open. But he doesn't. The familiar pattern unfolds with the inevitability of tragedy. She gives more and more. He withdraws further and further, until one day she finds herself exactly where she has been before, alone, confused, wondering how she ended up in the same relationship again, with a different person. This is the shadow's signature, the uncanny repetition, the sense of fate or curse, the feeling of being trapped in a loop we cannot escape. And the question that haunts us, why? Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we choose people who hurt us? Why do we recreate our pain? The answer is both simple and devastating. We don't choose these people consciously. We choose them unconsciously, with the ancient, wounded parts of ourselves that are still trying to resolve what could never be resolved in childhood. We choose them with our shadow. To understand this, we must understand the concept of the Imago, a term coined by Harville Hendrix to describe the unconscious template for romantic love that forms in our early years. The Imago is a composite image, cobbled together from the positive and negative traits of our primary caregivers, particularly those who wounded us most. It represents not who they actually were, but who they were to us, to our vulnerable, dependent child self. And here is the mechanism that governs so much of human suffering in relationship. As adults, we unconsciously seek out partners who match this imago, not because we are masochistic, but because the wounded child within us believes, with perfect illogic, that if we can get this person, this unavailable person, this critical person, this unpredictable person, to finally love us, we will heal the wound. We will finally be enough. We will finally be safe. This is the shadow's promise, that we can change the past by repeating it, that we can heal the childhood wound by finding someone with the same wounding patterns and getting them to love us this time. It is a beautiful, tragic, doomed strategy, and it governs more human relationship than most of us can bear to admit. For Maya, this pattern traces back to her father, distant, preoccupied, brilliant, impossible to reach. As a child, she learned that love means yearning, that connection requires pursuit, that her value depends on finally breaking through to the unreachable one. She learned to be the perfect daughter, anticipating needs, suppressing her own desires, contorting herself into whatever shape might finally earn his attention. She buried her anger at his neglect. She buried her sadness at being unseen. She buried her own neediness, her own hunger for connection, because these were unacceptable. They made her too much, too needy, too difficult. And all of this, the anger, the sadness, the hunger, the hurt, went into her shadow. Now, as an adult, she doesn't consciously remember making these decisions. She doesn't think to herself, "I will find men who repeat my father's emotional unavailability." But her unconscious remembers. Her shadow remembers. And with perfect, terrible precision, it guides her attraction toward men who will recreate the exact dynamic she learned in childhood. This is projection at its most powerful. She projects onto these men the image of her father. She sees in them the potential for the love she never received. She believes that this time, if she just does it right, the ending will be different. But of course it cannot be different, because she is not actually in relationship with these men as they are. She is in relationship with her own projection, with her own unresolved past, with her own shadow. And there is a second, even more hidden projection at work. She also projects onto these men the parts of herself she disowned, the autonomy she surrendered in order to be loved, the independence she sacrificed to avoid abandonment, the healthy selfishness, the capacity to say no, the willingness to take up space and demand what she needs. All of this she sees in them and secretly envies, secretly resents, secretly yearns for. They have the freedom she never allowed herself. They can be unavailable, while she must always be available. They can prioritize their needs, while she learned to prioritize everyone else's. In a twisted way, she is attracted to them because they embody the shadow qualities she disowned, the parts of herself she was never allowed to be. This is the terrible irony of projection. We often fall in love with people who possess the very qualities we most need to develop in ourselves. The woman who lost her voice marries a man who speaks too loudly. The man who disowned his emotions falls for a woman who feels everything intensely. We are drawn to our opposites not because opposites attract, but because they are not opposites at all. They are the shadow, the missing pieces, the disowned aspects of our own psyche made flesh. And then, inevitably, what we loved becomes what we hate. The quality that initially attracted us becomes the source of our greatest frustration. Maya falls in love with her partner's independence and then resents his emotional distance. The woman who loved her husband's emotional openness eventually derides him as weak. The man who adored his wife's intensity comes to see her as too much, too dramatic, too demanding. This flip, from love to hate, from attraction to repulsion, is the hallmark of projection. When we love someone for a quality that is actually our own disowned shadow, that love is inherently unstable, because what we are really loving is not them, but the part of ourselves we see in them. And eventually, we will come to resent them for possessing what we believe we cannot have. Jung called this phenomenon enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. In relationships, this means that the very quality that binds us to someone will eventually become the quality that tears us apart, unless we can make the projection conscious, unless we can reclaim the shadow quality in ourselves. But making projection conscious is perhaps the most difficult psychological work there is, because it requires us to give up our most cherished beliefs, that we are the victim, that they are the problem, that if they would just change, everything would be fine. It requires us to entertain the devastating possibility that we have been in relationship with our own psyche all along, that the drama we thought was being created by others has been our own drama, that we have been both the playwright and the actor in a tragedy of our own unconscious design. Consider the common relationship pattern of pursuer and distancer. One partner chases connection, the other runs from it. The pursuer believes the problem is the distancer's fear of intimacy. The distancer believes the problem is the pursuer's neediness. Both are projecting. Both are seeing in the other what they refuse to see in themselves. The pursuer has disowned her own need for autonomy, her own capacity to be alone, her own fear of intimacy hiding beneath the pursuit. She projects these qualities onto her partner and then judges him for having them. But she is actually chasing her own shadow, trying to capture in him the independence she surrendered long ago. The distancer has disowned his own need for connection, his own vulnerability, his own hunger to be truly seen. He projects these qualities onto his partner and then feels suffocated by them. But he is actually fleeing his own shadow, running from the dependence and need he learned to shame in childhood. And so they dance, pursuing and fleeing, convinced that if the other would just change, the relationship would work. But the truth is that they are perfectly matched, each carrying for the other exactly the shadow qualities they most need to reclaim. They are not incompatible. They are mirror-compatible. Each is the perfect projection screen for the other's unconscious. This pattern appears in countless variations: the controller and the rebel, the giver and the taker, the responsible one and the spontaneous one, the emotional one and the rational one. In each case, both partners have split themselves, taking one side of a human polarity and disowning the other. Then they find someone who embodies what they've rejected, and they fall in love with their own shadow. The tragedy is that these relationships, which could be opportunities for profound integration and wholeness, usually end in bitterness and blame. Instead of each partner reclaiming their disowned qualities, the pursuer learning healthy autonomy, the distancer learning healthy dependence, they simply leave and find new partners to recreate the same dynamic. The shadow finds a new screen. The projection finds a new target. Nothing changes except the names and faces. This is the repetition compulsion in its fullest flower. Freud observed it first in his work with trauma victims who would unconsciously recreate the traumatic situation over and over, as if trying to master what had once overwhelmed them. But the repetition extends far beyond trauma into the whole architecture of relationship. We repeat what we don't repair. We recreate what we don't integrate. Every unprocessed wound, every disowned quality, every unresolved pattern from our past. These become the invisible scripts that determine who we choose, how we love, and why we suffer. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand the mechanism. The brain forms implicit memories, non-conscious patterns of expectation based on early experiences that guide behavior without conscious awareness. When we encounter situations that match these patterns, even loosely, the brain activates the old emotional and behavioral responses automatically. We don't think, "This person reminds me of my father." We just feel an instant, inexplicable attraction or repulsion. These implicit patterns are especially powerful in attachment relationships. Our early experiences with caregivers create what attachment theorists call internal working models, templates for how relationships work, what we can expect from others, and who we need to be to stay safe and connected. If we learned that love is conditional on performance, we become adults who unconsciously choose partners who withhold approval until we prove ourselves. If we learned that connection requires caretaking, we choose partners who need rescuing. If we learned that closeness leads to engulfment, we choose partners we can keep at a distance. The shadow knows what it learned, and it seeks what is familiar, even when what is familiar is pain. But there is something more here, something that goes beyond mechanical repetition. There is something almost intelligent about the way the unconscious chooses our relationship partners. It's as if the psyche knows exactly what we need to see, exactly which shadows need to be illuminated, exactly which wounds need to be opened before they can be healed. Jung believed that the unconscious has a compensatory function, that it tries to balance and correct the one-sidedness of consciousness. If we have identified too strongly with being strong, the unconscious will send us situations that reveal our vulnerability. If we have identified as victim, the unconscious will show us our perpetrator. The shadow emerges not to destroy us, but to complete us. From this perspective, the people we attract into our lives are not random. They are precisely chosen, not by conscious will, but by the self-organizing intelligence of the psyche to show us what we most need to see. Every difficult relationship is a teaching, every painful pattern a curriculum, every shadow projection a sacred clue about where we need to direct our attention inward. This doesn't make the pain any less real. It doesn't excuse anyone's harmful behavior, but it does shift the locus of power. If our relationships are mirrors of our psyche, then changing our relationships requires changing our psyche. If we keep meeting ourselves, then the way forward is not to find different people, it's to meet ourselves differently. This is the descent into the shadow's depth, the recognition that we are not innocent bystanders in our own story, that our suffering is not simply inflicted upon us by others, but emerges from the complex interaction between our unhealed wounds and the world. It is the recognition that we have been, all along, in relationship with ourselves. And it is here, in this recognition, that transformation becomes possible. The moment of awakening comes differently for everyone. Sometimes it arrives as a sudden revelation, a flash of recognition that reframes everything in an instant. More often, it comes gradually, through the accumulation of suffering, the exhaustion of repetition, the slow dawning awareness that the common factor in all your failed relationships is you. For Maya, it came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after her latest relationship ended. She was telling her therapist the familiar story, how he had been emotionally unavailable, how she had tried everything, how it wasn't fair, when her therapist asked a simple question that stopped her mid-sentence. What part of yourself were you trying to get him to love? The question hung in the air like a bell that won't stop ringing. And in that moment, something shifted. The narrative she had been telling herself, the story of victim and perpetrator, of her giving and his withholding, suddenly became transparent. She could see through it to something more fundamental, more painful, more true. She had not been trying to get him to love her. She had been trying to get him to love the parts of herself she had never learned to love. The needy parts, the hungry parts, the parts that wanted attention and validation and someone to truly see her. She had outsourced her self-love to him, made him responsible for healing a wound that only she could heal, and in doing so she had made it impossible for him to ever succeed, because what she needed from him was not actually love. It was redemption. She needed him to undo her childhood. She needed him to be the father who finally chose her. She needed him to prove that she was, after all this time, enough. But he was not her father, and she was no longer a child. And the wound she was trying to heal through him could only be healed through herself. This is the awakening, the moment we turn the mirror around, the moment we stop asking, "What are they doing to me?" and start asking, "What am I doing to myself through them?" It is the shift from projection to introspection, from blame to responsibility, from repetition to consciousness. And it begins with a practice that is both simple and impossibly difficult: radical self-inquiry. Every time we feel triggered by someone, every time we react with disproportionate emotion, every time we find ourselves in a familiar painful pattern, we must pause and ask, what quality am I seeing in them that I refuse to see in myself? This is the golden question, the key that unlocks the shadow's treasure. When Maya asked herself this question, here is what she found. She saw in her unavailable partners the autonomy she had disowned, the capacity to prioritize her own needs, to say no, to maintain boundaries. She had learned so early that her value came from being available to others that she had completely lost touch with her own right to unavailability. When she saw it in them, she both envied it and resented it. She saw in them the self-sufficiency she had abandoned, the ability to be alone without feeling incomplete. She had organized her entire identity around being needed, being connected, being in relationship. When she saw their capacity to be content without her, it threatened her entire sense of self. And beneath both of these, she saw in them the quality she most desperately needed to reclaim, the ability to love themselves. They could walk away from relationships that didn't serve them. They could disappoint others without collapsing in shame. They could exist without external validation. They possessed, in other words, exactly what she had been seeking from them: self-love. This recognition is brutal and liberating in equal measure. Brutal because it means we can no longer blame others for our pain. Liberating because it means we are no longer powerless victims of others' behavior. If the shadow we see in others is actually our own, then we can reclaim it. We can integrate it. We can become whole. But how? How do we actually integrate the shadow? How do we reclaim the disowned parts of ourselves that we have been projecting onto others for decades? The first step is radical honesty. We must be willing to see and own the qualities in ourselves that we have been denying. This is harder than it sounds, because the shadow is defended by powerful psychological forces: shame, fear, and the ego's need to maintain its story of who we are. When Maya tried to acknowledge her own neediness, the qualities she had judged most harshly in herself and projected most strongly onto others, she encountered enormous resistance. Her entire identity was built around being the strong one, the giver, the one who didn't need anyone. To admit her need felt like ego death, like the collapse of everything she believed herself to be. But this is precisely the initiation the shadow requires. We must be willing to die to who we thought we were in order to become who we actually are. We must surrender our sanitized self-image and embrace our full humanity, the light and the dark, the beautiful and the ugly, the noble and the shameful. Jung called this process shadow integration, and he considered it essential for psychological maturity. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, that would be both impossible and undesirable, but to make it conscious, to withdraw our projections, to own what is ours. This involves several practices. First, we must learn to recognize our projections. This requires developing what Buddhists call witness consciousness, the ability to observe our own mental processes without being completely identified with them. When we feel a strong emotional charge around someone's behavior, that charge is a signal that projection may be at work. The question to ask is, why am I so activated by this? What does their behavior symbolize for me? What am I seeing in them that I need to see in myself? Second, we must practice dialogue with our shadow. This can be done through journaling, active imagination, or working with a therapist. We must give voice to the disowned parts of ourselves. Let them speak, understand what they need, and why they were exiled. The shadow doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be heard, understood, and ultimately integrated. Third, we must develop compassion for our shadow. The qualities we have disowned were usually banished because we needed to survive, emotionally, socially, psychologically. The angry child learned to suppress anger because expressing it led to rejection. The sad child learned to hide sadness because it made adults uncomfortable. The shadow is not our enemy. It is the part of us that took the hit so that the rest of us could go on. Fourth, we must take responsibility for expressing shadow qualities in healthy ways. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean acting out every disowned impulse. It means bringing these qualities into consciousness and finding constructive channels for their expression. The woman who has disowned her anger doesn't need to become rageful. She needs to learn healthy assertion. The man who has disowned his vulnerability doesn't need to become weak. He needs to learn healthy openness. As Maya worked with her shadow, something remarkable happened in her relationships. As she learned to acknowledge and meet her own needs, she stopped desperately seeking someone else to meet them. As she developed her own autonomy, she stopped being threatened by others' independence. As she learned to love herself, she stopped needing others to prove her lovability. And with these shifts, her attraction patterns began to change. She found herself drawn to different kinds of people, not because she was consciously choosing differently, but because her unconscious template had been updated. The Imago that had governed her attractions for decades began to loosen its grip. She could see people more clearly, as they actually were, rather than through the distorting lens of projection. This is the promise of shadow work in relationships. Not that we will find perfect people or perfect relationships, but that we will become more whole people capable of more real relationships. We will stop casting others in the roles of our past and start meeting them in the present. We will stop using relationship as a strategy for avoiding ourselves and start using it as a practice for becoming ourselves. But this work is never finished. Even when we integrate one layer of shadow, another emerges. Even when we withdraw one projection, others remain. The psyche has depths beneath depths, and the work of becoming conscious is the work of a lifetime. Moreover, projection is not always problematic. Jung understood that projection is also how we recognize potential in ourselves and others. When we see qualities in others that we admire, that inspire us, that call us to grow, these too are projections. They are projections of our own unlived potential, qualities that exist in us as seeds waiting to be cultivated. The poet Rumi understood this when he wrote, "The beloved is everywhere, looking with your eyes, tasting with your tongue." What we love in others is often the divine spark that exists in ourselves, but has not yet been kindled into flame. The difference between shadow projection and light projection is this. Shadow projections keep us stuck in the past, while light projections call us into our future. The key is consciousness. Conscious projection becomes vision. We see the potential in others and are inspired to develop it in ourselves. Unconscious projection becomes prison. We see only our wounds in others and remain trapped in repetition. And there is one more crucial insight here. As we integrate our shadow, we develop something that revolutionizes all our relationships, the capacity to see others clearly. When we are no longer blinded by projection, when we have reclaimed our disowned qualities, we can finally meet another person as they actually are, not as a symbol or screen for our unconscious content. This is what Martin Buber called the I-though relationship, the encounter between two whole subjects, neither reducing the other to an object or projection. It is rare, precious, and impossibly difficult to sustain, but it is the gold that shadow work makes possible. Authentic connection, not between projections, but between presences. In the Kabbalistic tradition, there is a concept called Tzimtzum, the withdrawal of divine presence to create space for the other to exist. This is what happens when we withdraw our projections. We create space for the other to be themselves, rather than forcing them to be our projection. It is an act of profound respect and love. The recognition that the other is not here to complete us, heal us, or redeem our past, but simply to be themselves. And paradoxically, it is only in this space, where we stop using the other to avoid ourselves, that genuine intimacy becomes possible. Because genuine intimacy requires two people who have done the work of becoming whole, who are no longer frantically seeking their missing pieces in each other, but are choosing to share their wholeness. This is the revolution that shadow work offers, the possibility of relationship based not on need, but on choice, not on projection, but on presence, not on the unconscious repetition of the past, but on the conscious creation of something new. We have traveled deep into the architecture of human connection, into the mechanisms of projection and shadow, into the painful patterns that govern so much of our relating, and we have discovered something that changes everything, that every person we meet is a mirror, and what we see in them is ultimately ourselves. But this is not the end of the story, because once we understand this, once we really grasp that we have been meeting ourselves in every relationship, a new question emerges. What happens when we meet ourselves consciously? What happens when we stop fleeing from the shadow and turn to face it? What happens when we reclaim the disowned parts of ourselves that we have been projecting onto others? What happens when we withdraw our projections and see people as they actually are? Something unexpected. We become free. Free from the compulsive repetition of the past. Free from the tyranny of unconscious patterns. Free to choose our relationships consciously rather than being chosen by our wounds. And we become whole. The shadow, once integrated, ceases to be shadow. It becomes simply another aspect of ourselves, neither good nor bad, but human. The qualities we once saw as unacceptable become available to us. The parts we exiled return home. We are no longer fragments pretending to be whole. We become actually genuinely more complete. This is the promise of shadow work, but also its paradox. We cannot do it alone. We need relationship to reveal the shadow. We need the mirror of the other to see ourselves. We need the clash and friction of intimate connection to illuminate what is hidden. And yet, we cannot truly be in relationship until we have integrated the shadow, because as long as we are projecting, we are not meeting the other. We are meeting ourselves. The work of becoming whole and the work of authentic connection are not separate. They are the same work, approached from different angles. This is why the ancient traditions spoke of relationship as a spiritual practice, a yoga, a path of awakening. Not because relationship is easy, but because it is difficult in precisely the ways we need. Every conflict is a koan, every trigger a teaching, every painful pattern an invitation to consciousness. You will keep meeting yourself in your relationships. This is not a problem to be solved, it is the structure of human consciousness. But how you meet yourself can change everything. You can meet yourself unconsciously through projection and repetition and remain trapped in patterns that generate suffering. Or you can meet yourself consciously through shadow work and integration and gradually become free. The choice is not whether to project. We will always project to some degree. The choice is whether to make our projections conscious, whether to reclaim our shadow, whether to use our relationships as mirrors for self-knowledge rather than as stages for unconscious drama. And as more humans learn to do this work, as more of us withdraw our projections and reclaim our shadows, something shifts in the collective field of human relating. We create the possibility of relationship based on consciousness rather than unconsciousness, on wholeness rather than woundedness, on presence rather than past. This is the evolution of human connection that is trying to happen, from unconscious repetition to conscious creation, from shadow projection to shadow integration, from using others to avoid ourselves to meeting others through meeting ourselves. The mirror is still waiting, your reflection is still calling. But now you understand. The face you see is not separate from you. The shadow you meet in others is your own. And every relationship, every painful, beautiful, agonizing, illuminating relationship is an opportunity to come home to yourself. The ancient oracle at Delphi inscribed above its entrance a simple command: know thyself. And the deepest path to that knowledge is through relationship, through the mirror of the other, through the courageous work of seeing and owning and integrating everything we have been, everything we are, and everything we might become. You have been meeting yourself your entire life. The question is, are you ready, finally, to recognize yourself when you do? The shadow in relationships is not the problem. It is the path. And the person standing before you, reflecting back what you most need to see, They are not your enemy or your savior. They are your teacher, your mirror, your invitation to wholeness. Welcome them, honor them, and through them, meet yourself fully, finally, fearlessly. Because in the end, there is only one relationship that matters, one mirror that contains all others, the relationship you have with yourself. Every external relationship is practice for that one. Every external mirror is preparation for turning inward and, at last, becoming both the seer and the seen. This is the wisdom the shadow holds, that we are not separate from what we meet, that the beloved is not out there, the beloved is the one looking through our eyes, that we have been, all along, both the seeker and the sought, both the question and the answer, both the mirror and the face reflected in it. And when we finally understand this, when we truly see it, we are free. Free to love without needing to be saved. Free to connect without losing ourselves. Free to meet another human being not as a solution to our emptiness, but as a celebration of our fullness. The journey ends where it began, with a face in the mirror. But now we recognize it. Now we claim it. Now we know. That face has always been ours.